Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a truly wild slice of American history. We're looking at a time when an intense corporate crackdown didn't just crush a rebellion, it actually ignited the modern labor movement.
So, to really get this, let's jump right to the absolute climax of the story in 1921. We're talking about a terrifying moment where completely unchecked authority collided head-on with thousands of furious, desperate citizens. And this collision, it resulted in the largest armed uprising on American soil since the Civil War.
13,000. That's the staggering number of coal miners who marched on Logan County, West Virginia. Just picture that for a second. An army of 13,000 everyday working men traveling on foot and taking over trains, basically demanding basic human rights and an end to violent corporate rule. But how did they reach such an absolute boiling point? Well, we need to rewind a bit.
To grasp why these guys were literally willing to risk their lives, you have to understand the immense cultural and economic weight coal held over the whole region back then. Bituminous coal had totally rewired West Virginia's economy. By 1917, you had roughly 90,000 miners digging up nearly 90 million tons of coal every single year. Coal wasn't just some commodity. People honestly viewed it as the engine of civilization itself. And the rule of the day was pretty simple. Whoever controlled the coal controlled absolutely everything else.
And this brings us to a really fascinating sociological concept called the backfire effect. Normally, conventional wisdom tells us that overwhelming, brutal force will crush dissent. You hit a rebellion hard enough and it shatters, right? But the backfire effect suggests the exact opposite. It argues that when one side acts with sheer, brutal indifference to public opinion, they actually amplify public sympathy for the victims, which ironically ends up strengthening the exact movement they were trying so hard to destroy.
Now, for this backfire effect to actually trigger, researchers point out that two specific conditions have to be met. First off, an action has to happen that is wildly excessive or deeply unjust. Second, information about that specific injustice must be clearly communicated to a wider audience, because if nobody hears about it, well, the effect just doesn't happen. So let's see how these two elements played out in the coalfields.
Let's jump back to the late 19th century to look at the suffocating baseline conditions these miners were living under. Imagine an industry so incredibly powerful and wealthy that it basically becomes the government. Labor historian Selig Perlman actually called this an industrial government. These coal barons had incredibly deep pockets, and they used that money to secure almost total political control over local and state governments. There was no real separation of powers here. State and industrial interests were essentially the exact same thing.
So miners were completely trapped in this highly exploitative system, backed by politicians who were just looked the other way. I mean, imagine your employer having total control over every aspect of your life. Miners weren't even paid in US dollars, they were paid in company's scrip, a private currency. This cleverly forced them to buy all their daily necessities from the marked-up company store. They also had to sign yellow dog contracts, strictly forbidding any union membership. Their company-owned homes could be searched or repossessed without any notice. And if they stepped out of line, they could literally be imprisoned indefinitely without anything resembling a proper trial. It was less of a job and more of an industrial prison.
As you can imagine, an immense amount of discontent was brewing just under the surface. And as famous, fiery union organizers like Mary Harris Mother Jones pushed their way into the region, this pressure cooked up a massive powder keg. What followed was a deadly, defining decade of escalating compression, marked by three major historical flashpoints: Paint Creek, Matewan, and Blair Mountain.
It all kicked off with the initially peaceful Paint Creek strike in 1912. The miners just wanted their pay raise to meet standard local rates. When management said no, they went on strike and were instantly evicted from their company homes, forcing them into these temporary tent camps. In response, management hired the notorious Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, and what these armed guards did next is almost unbelievable. They literally built a makeshift armored train, called it the Bull Moose Express, and drove it through the valley at night, firing high-powered machine guns directly into the evicted miners' family tent camps. It perfectly checks the box for our first condition, a wildly excessive, undeniably unjust action.
Fast forward a bit to Matewan in 1920, and the tension snapped again. When 300 miners decided to join the union, the company instantly fired them and sent armed agents to oversee their sudden evictions. Well, this heavy-handed tactic sparked a massive, incredibly tense standoff in the town. And this aggressive eviction of union-aligned miners quickly culminated in a deadly shootout. It even involved a sympathetic local mayor who tragically lost his life, along with the local police chief, Sid Hatfield. By the time the smoke cleared, 10 people were dead in what became known as the Matewan Massacre. The human cost was absolutely devastating, and the stakes, they were now life or death.
So tensions are at an absolute breaking point. But a year later, the companies pushed it even further. Private detectives brazenly assassinated police chief Sid Hatfield in broad daylight, right on the McDowell County courthouse steps. Hatfield had actually stood up for the miners, and his murder absolutely enraged thousands of workers across the southern portion of the state. By committing such a public, ruthless act, the companies triggered what historians call elevation through denigration. Essentially, the miners instantly claimed the undeniable moral high ground. They went from being seen as just disgruntled employees to the undeniable victims of a totally corrupt system.
And this profound injustice was the ultimate catalyst. It was like a match dropping straight into that powder keg we talked about, prompting those 13,000 miners to take up arms. Moving with incredible momentum, they commandeered a freight train they called the Blue Steel Special and marched en masse toward Logan County. Their objective was clear: cross Blair Mountain and free their jailed colleagues by force.
But at Blair Mountain, these 13,000 miners, who were mostly just equipped with vintage rifles and hunting gear, were met by an overwhelming wall of military force. The local sheriff had assembled a private anti-union army of nearly 2,000 men. But it didn't stop there. No way. President Harding sent 2,500 federal troops, leftover chemical weapons from World War I, and even a squadron of bomber aircraft led by General Billy Mitchell to literally drop explosives. It was a completely unprecedented use of overwhelming military might deployed directly against American citizens.
Now this brings us right back to the second step of the backfire effect, communication. Because the national and local press ended up telling entirely different stories about this massive battle on the mountain. The national press? They wanted to sell papers, so they sensationalized the violence, basically painting the miners as lawless, unruly hillbillies. They created this sense of separation, making West Virginia sound like some chaotic foreign land to the rest of the country. But the local press took an entirely different, incredibly powerful approach.
That local coverage successfully humanized the miners. They printed these detailed, heartfelt obituaries of the fallen men. They clearly explained the union's actual demands right alongside the sheer, overwhelming brutality they faced from the government and the corporations. By communicating this stark reality and framing the miners as victims of extreme state force, this local coverage generated deep, deep public sympathy. And that deeply fortified the union's identity among the regional population. Now, it would be incredibly easy to look at the immediate aftermath of Blair Mountain and just assume the miners lost. I mean, look at the numbers. United Mine Workers membership in the state plummeted from 42,000 all the way down to just 16,000 by 1933. And honestly, you can understand why. Who wants to risk their life against a literal military bombing run just to go to work? In the short term, the absolute brute force deployed by the state and the coal companies was devastatingly effective at breaking the strikes.
However, the historical sources show us something really important. While short-term repression can momentarily crush a movement, the backfire effect is very often a delayed reaction. It ends up causing a massive, long-term resurgence of dissent over time. The deep trauma of Paint Creek, Matewan, and Blair Mountain didn't just vanish into thin air. The public outrage simmered, and that shared, intense suffering forged an unbreakable sense of solidarity beneath the surface. It was just waiting for the right moment.
And aided by the long, painful memory of those exact wrongdoings, the labor movement roared back to life in the 1930s. Spurred on by the passage of new federal New Deal labor laws, union membership absolutely exploded. The movement was ultimately fueled by the very same repression that was designed to completely destroy it a decade earlier. The backfire effect had done its work perfectly, turning the victims of extreme force into the architects of a powerful new labor era.
The West Virginia Coal Wars remain a profound historical lesson in power perception and incredible human resilience. So I'll leave you with this final thought to consider. In the face of deep injustice, does brute force ever truly extinguish a movement, or does it inevitably plant the seeds of its own backfire? Thank you so much for exploring this explainer with me today, and keep questioning the history around you.